Good morning. Now, Europe was the center of the Western world during the height of the Renaissance era. Humanistic thought was the center of education, with people studying poetry, grammar, history, moral philosophy, and rhetoric. Humanists studied the ancient texts with a method of reasoning and empirical evidence instead of the comparison of authors and works favored by the medieval scholars. Art was at its peak. Painters and sculptors like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, Titian, and Botticelli were contemporaries. Architects like Brunelleschi, Bramante, Sangallo, and Moderno were creating some of the most beautiful buildings in the world that stand to this day. Science was thriving. In the early Renaissance, the discovery of the New World challenged the classical worldview, as did the works of Ptolemy in geography and Galen in medicine. One important development was not any specific discovery, but rather the further development for the process of discovery, the scientific method. It focused on empirical evidence, the importance of mathematics, and discarded the ancient science established by the philosopher Aristotle. Early and influential proponents of these ideas included Copernicus, Galileo, and Francis Bacon. The new scientific method led to great contributions in the fields of astronomy, physics, biology, and anatomy. This was the surface, a surface beautifully decorated, but still very much steeped in religion and superstition. The church still controlled everything: art, music, culture. If you look at the paintings from that era, they're all religious. The only acceptable way to paint a nude was either in a religious context or in a mythological context. There was no in between. To pay for the expensive Basilica of St. Peter, the seat of the Holy See, Pope Leo X authorized the sale of indulgences. Indulgences were, as I understand, golden tickets to heaven, a papal get-out-of-jail-free card, if you will. A wealthy individual could purchase a few of these indulgences, and their conscience could be clear, and they'd be assured of a place in heaven. Justo Gonzalez tells us that one of the men put in charge of this task was a Dominican friar by the name of John Tetzel, who had no scruples in selling his product, promising that the sinner would be cleaner than coming out of the baptism, or cleaner than Adam before the fall, and that the cross of the seller of the indulgences had as much power as the cross of Christ. He even promised redemption of souls departed, saying, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. This was a quick and dirty way of the church to raise the necessary funds to finance the construction project of the basilica, as well as an impressive tomb for Leo. It was at that point that Luther nailed his famous 95 Theses on the door of the castle at the church in Wittenberg. His theses were not written to cause a great religious commotion, as he had hoped would be the case with his earlier work. These 95 theses, written with such a deep sense of righteous indignation, were much more devastating than the earlier ones. While addressing fewer theological issues, they did invoke a positive response from those who resented the exploitation of Germany by foreign interests. Luther didn't just question the sale, he called the Pope out for his audacity. He asked the Pope that if he could free souls from purgatory, then why not use that power to help the poor who were being downtrodden even further by the folks who were purchasing those said indulgences? You can see where this is going. Luther was eventually excommunicated for his efforts in the Reformation in 1520, and rather reluctantly formed his own church and worship. He even married a former nun and had a family of his own. Ultimately, whether or not he wanted to, Luther sparked the Protestant Reformation And it was there that splintered the hold that the Catholic Church had on the Western world and ushered in a new era where no longer was the Pope second only to angels. No longer did man need a priest to act as an intermediary to God. The Bible was being printed now and could be in several languages, making it possible for any educated person to read the good news. Education was at its peak because more and more people were able to start reading because the Bible was printed in their native language. Mark Taylor says in his book, After God, that by taking away the central authority, which was the church, and moving it into the hands of the people, we would not have the society we have now. The shattering of one worldview made way for another, and in doing so, sowed the seeds for unprecedented growth and social evolution. He even speculates that these changes caused the evolution of our technology that ultimately led to the adoption of free market capitalism and the creation of the personal computer and internet. It's actually a really fascinating theory. If we did not have the Reformation, now think about that, if we didn't have that Reformation, then we would not have had Unitarianism. No Reformation, no free thought. We would not have had an American Revolution. We certainly wouldn't have had the freedom that we enjoy today. We would still most likely be ruled by a monarch. I would even go so far as to question if technology would have even advanced as quickly. Would we even have had an industrial revolution? The reason why I say that is because scientists like Galileo faced incredible backlash during the Renaissance when they questioned the authority of the church on scientific matters. Galileo went against the official position that the sun, moon, and planets rotated around the earth. He proved using scientific reasoning and empirical evidence that we were a solar-centric system, that all the planets, including the earth, rotated around the sun. He was put under house arrest for this crime. I think that kind of shows what overreaching power the church had over science. I think that we might all still be Europeans because I'm not certain if we would have ever left Europe since there was nothing to run from, the religious persecution of our forefathers being one of them. We might have been comfortable having and continued having an intermediary, being a priest or the very church itself telling us how to live and what to believe in. Who knows? Maybe the Holy Roman Empire would have never crumbled. Now, bringing us back to Taylor, and this is where we get the title of my sermon today, Is God Gold? Taylor draws allusions to the works of Andy Warhol and the televangelist preacher Billy Graham. Warhol took pop culture items, threw them up on silk screens, thus taking our consumerism and selling it back to us. He commodified art. Using the medium of television, Billy Graham launched a successful televangelism ministry where he regularly asked contributions from his audience. He commodified religion. Even now, this is being repeated in our current political climate. Our own president surrounds himself with preachers of the prosperity gospel, which says that as long as you work hard and donate all your money to the churches, you will be rewarded with a place in heaven, your illnesses will be cured, and money will certainly find you. Sound familiar? To me, this sounds like history repeating itself, almost a bastardization of what was happening in the Renaissance. Now, in 1971, President Richard Nixon was under intense pressure to remove us from the gold standard, in which our money was linked to gold. You could walk into any bank, hand them $1, and say, I want $1 worth in gold. All other world currencies were bound to the dollar. The government gave up the gold standard, eventually letting the dollar float. Going off the gold standard was the economic equivalent of the death of God, Taylor says. Gold functions in the economic system just as God functions in religion. Gold is a sign constructed to deny its status as a sign, thereby ground the value of other monetary signs. By removing the currency from the gold standard, we opened our market and our currency to speculative finance. The dollar only has value because we say it, because the government say it does. Replace the word gold with God. God is a sign constructed to deny their status as a sign and thereby ground the value of all religious signs. Take us back even further, replace this idea with church. The church was the gold standard. I'm talking church with the big C, not the little c. We took the gold standard away, thereby opening the teachings of the church and the Bible to speculation. God became a construct that only had value because we gave it value. Therefore, by this formula, God is gold. Now, we Unitarian Universalists have a long history of doing just that. We consistently take ourselves off of whatever gold standard we're currently espousing. We evolve. We started with liberal Calvinism, which morphed into transcendentalism. Unitarian Universalists are hyper-Protestant. This was a term coined by my theology professor and religious naturalist, Dr. Michael Hogue. While we're comfortable with the gold standard for a while, we eventually begin to see its flaws, and we set out to change it. It might take a while, because you know everything has to go to committee. But it does change. We have a central authority, but the power rests here. It's in our churches. We have embraced science, reasoning, technology, and social justice, which can be anathema to other religious groups. We are not perfect. We still need to find and embrace our common ground. While training a young man at Disneyland several years ago in the costuming department, yes, I worked at Disneyland for 9 years. I survived the mouse. We discussed religion during our lunch break because he was fascinated about the idea of a church being so accepting of LGBT individuals, and by the fact that I was becoming a minister in this very rich tradition. He told me that the only information he ever got about Unitarian Universalism was a dismissive comment made by a professor teaching a class on religion at his college, and I paraphrase here, Unitarian Universalism isn't a religion. It's a social group that masquerades as a church. They aren't even worth talking about, so I won't. During a recent conversation with a fellow student at Meadville Lombard, the UU seminary I attend, she mentioned that she felt that humanists were under attack while she was at school. She felt that humanists like herself were being forced to accept that this new idea that God was a thing now, and they just had to accept it. While I'm not a secular humanist myself, I can empathize with her, being that I am a pagan within a larger denomination that sometimes looks at me with a certain degree of appraisal. She felt that old guard humanists found a way to be religious without the trappings of religion, found a way to be very spiritual without sacrificing their personal beliefs. I then understood where she was coming from. If her spirituality wasn't broke, then why fix it? In a conversation with an atheist member of our home church, my budding theologian's son was asked why, as an engineering and science student, he believes in God, let alone multiple gods. His response: you use a plastic card assigned a random number that you throw out into the ether, knowing that you'll receive something. This item almost always shows up at your doorstep. How is my belief in multiple gods any different? I wonder if this is our new gold standard, or Reformation, finding a way to truly balance the secular with the spiritual, the deist-theist with the secular, humanist, atheist, and Darwinist. Then my question becomes this: can we first define Unitarian Universalism in a way that causes people to see us as a faith rather than as a social group? And secondly, can we make room for everyone at the table without sacrificing our deeply held beliefs? Have we become so entrenched in our structure and beliefs that we can't stop to find a common ground? While I was at school, there was a lot of talk of a shared language of reverence. This is religious language that we can all agree on. There was a discussion on whether or not we even had rituals, and if all the ones that we agree on are just too homogenized or even watered down. I know that there are numbers of times when I felt frustrated listening to the sheer numbers of people that we're losing as a faith because we are either A, too loose for them or too individualistic, or B, we're not inclusive to their beliefs and we often feel inclined to tell them what's wrong with them. Coffee hour. It's a thing. Maybe not here, just from personal experience. We are losing our Christians and up to other liberal churches, and we're losing the ear of our atheists as well. Where is our shared faith? Where is our shared theology? Where is our shared language of reverence? I like my deities to be imperfect with human foibles, which is why I love the Greek pantheon of gods. If you've ever read the stories of Zeus, you understand. But I also love the ideas expressed by Mary Daly when she compared God to a verb rather than a noun. I interpret this as doing rather than simply believing. Doesn't this speak to us as Unitarian Universalists? It has been said many times that you use show up. So if God is gold, and they only have the worth that we assign it, she, them, why can't this be anything we choose? God, goddess, action, or even not God? My deepest hope is that we can find that balance. While we do not have to believe in our previous Christian theology, we must acknowledge that we started with a questioning of the Trinity, of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, adopting a non-Trinitarian doctrine. This is where we get the term Unitarian. We still believe in universal salvation in our own ways. We stopped believing in hell a long time ago, but that we are all worthy of salvation. We're all worthy of love. This is where we get universalist. We do not believe in a creed that tells us how to behave in the world. We are covenantal, which means that we should truly trust and respect one another. Covenant is a contract that we all agree on as an act of faith. If we are going to acknowledge the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, which is our first principle, right? We need to see that there are many paths to the same goal. We have Christian members and pagan members. We have a rich humanist tradition that welcomes atheists, naturalists, and Darwinists. By the way, Darwin was a Unitarian. A song that brought me to tears when I first heard it was I Need You to Survive. You heard the choir sing this earlier. Imagine sitting in a room with about 2,000 people singing that all at once. It's pretty darn moving. We all need one another to survive because our faith demands it. I need you all to survive because you teach me to be a better human and a better Unitarian Universalist. I need you all to survive because I believe in you and the work that you do and are capable of. This is our newest reformation. We need to embrace it. We don't evangelize and share our good news. Unitarian Universalism is our currency, and since we removed our gold standard a long time ago, we must show folks what our religion and what our faith is worth. We need to be free with our riches and share the wealth of our collective wisdom. We need to be receptive in receiving those riches that are offered to us from others as well. We don't have to agree with everything. We need to prove that we are not a social group masquerading as a church, and that we are worth talking about. This in itself is an act of faith. Is God gold? Let's sit down and talk about it together. And with that, I say amen, salam, namaste, and blessed be.